$14.000, artinya luar biasa gitu. Ya, kita sudah sampai di sini. Masih tahap awal tapi ada 1 juta. Kalau hilirisasinya terjadi, itu pabrik, ya kita berharap ada untuk home appliances, ada untuk otomotif, ada untuk yang lain. Kalau itu terjadi artinya luar biasa sekali nilai tambahnya, Pak. Baik, itu yang bisa saya sampaikan.
Thank you. Jalan. Yeah. Thank you, Pak Dodi. I think, yeah, if I can just sum up what you said, the policy to encourage the building of smelters has been very critical to the growth of industry, and in many sectors of industry, especially in the manufacturing of steel, yeah, and other industries, which will support many other industries. So thank you for that. If I can move on to Pak Prihadi, from the chairman of the Indonesian Smelters Association. From your perspective, Pak, in terms of the Association of Smelters, I'm sure you support the government's policy in terms of building smelters, but maybe you could tell us some of the challenges that you face.
Thank you, Mr. Swipe. I think we're talking about energy, right?
Yes.
It's the main topic of the day.
That's the topic of the conference. Yeah.
Conference. Okay, so let me restrict myself on commenting why energy is so important to the ingredients, to the elements of how much the operating cost of a smelter is. On the average, when we're talking about the smelter, not the refining stage, the smelter on the average consumes like about between 35 to 45% of its operating costs. So it's one single element that is so crucial to the existence of building a smelter. And so since energy is in the realms of the government, we would like to have the government be number one, consistent with its policies. I may just want to give an example of the company who I'm working for, that's PT Smelting. Back in the mid-90s, when the PT Freeport Indonesia, as prescribed under its contract of work, have to build a smelter, it's the very first article that they have to build a smelter within 5 years after the government gave its second contract of work. And at that time, the Japanese then decided to find a location. Location is very important here. And so choosing is that there were a pocket of gas production sharing contractors within and around East Java area. So it becomes a very important aspect why the location is in East Java. 20 years later, that also become a factor why PT Freeport Indonesia chose its location in East Java.
Right.
But to our dismay, most of the production sharing contract expires and they change hand and they have different marketing strategies and things like that. We couldn't access those gas that we have pursued initially before even building or setting up our feasibility study. So we will then have to face competition for other user. And many industry in East Java are using gas as a base to fuel their operation. And then it becomes so that we were doing our third expansion, we have no other alternative than going to PLN. We thought PLN would be our savior, but no. And this is the reason why. PLN is too big of an animal. They are not flexible. They want to do and run the way they would like to do. But we were already entrapped by PLN, who is always treating us that they are big brothers, and so the small brothers just have to obey. So in that light, there should be competition. There should not be just one sole source of state-owned enterprise monopolizing distribution of energy. So that's what we would like for the government to do. So in short, it's a pity that when I compare it to what our Gresik plant is operating, that our competitiveness in the commodity market in Southeast Asia compared to Japan, our energy cost is slightly higher, 5%, now moving up, creeping up to perhaps 10% of the Japan. But that's ironical because we have the gas.
Yes.
We have the infrastructure to produce it. However, they can sell it much more cheap. So that I would like for the government to realize. That's all, sir.
Thank you very much. But I think you've hit a nail on the head in terms of the challenges that face your industry. Source of energy and the cost of energy, of course, is critical to the smelting industry. If I can move to Stanley, from a market perspective, you study the markets and you study many of the companies that are listed on the Jakarta Stock Exchange and maybe even globally in terms of the industry. Maybe first of all, before we touch on the smelters, just look at the overall, what is your outlook for the mineral sector? Yeah, I mean, I know this is the energy forum, but this panel is about the mineral sector and coal sector, you know. How do you see the outlook for this sector?
Thank you, Pak. Before I kick off, I would like to say my thank you for this opportunity to be able to sit here with the sector heavyweights, right, from Pak Bambang, Pak Dodi, Pak Priyadi, maupun Pak Hendra, yeah, the sector's heavyweight. I'm very honored to be here. So on minerals, I've looked at this sector quite closely for some time, and especially nickel, yeah, Pak, because nickel is, I think, the most relevant commodity for a lot of stock investors. But if we were to look at other commodity, there may not be that many stocks for investors to invest in Indonesia, right? So on nickel, I think the outlook, generally speaking, it's not going to be easy, right? Given the fact that nickel is a base metal. This is very much different to bulk commodities like thermal coal. Thermal coal, when the market faces oversupply, bulk commodities, typically they need to do a market clearing mechanism right through the physical market. If base metals, nickel, they have what's called the inventory exchange system. And that's the reason why, despite we have a relatively healthy demand for nickel globally, how come it seems like nickel prices have not been able to go up more than $10,000 per ton? And that's the reason. We have the inventory exchange system. And not only in the inventory exchange system, after we have used nickel, and for the first time usage of nickel, typically it's called the primary nickel. After we have consumed the primary nickel, what's next is that we have a scrap nickel. So it seems like this kind of supply for base metals are very much sticky in the entire system globally. But with that said, right, I think global demand for nickel should continue to be relatively healthy. Global nickel demand have been growing by around 2%, with 50% of the demand mostly coming from China. Whereas for other countries like Europe, mostly this kind of demand from these countries are typically flat. So that's why if we look at the global demand around 1 to 2%. So the demand side, I think nickel should continue to stay healthy. The supply side is what I think can be quite of a concern, right? Because in terms of nickel supply, China supplies roughly around 20+% kind of supply share globally. And China has been cutting a lot of production as well. But this production cuts need to be reinforced by cuts elsewhere as well. Because if not, then supply will still continue to be in the system, right? And also, from the demand side, I think nickel is very much geared toward what's called the late cycle consumer demand, whereas coal is more geared toward early cycle. As countries boost their infrastructure spendings, they usually require to purchase coal first. Whereas nickel is much more geared toward the late cycle consumer demand via demand in household appliances, household utensils, right? So that's the story for nickel, and we have an inventory issue, definitely. And to put this into context for Indonesia, Indonesia last year produced roughly around 80 to 90,000 tons of pure nickel via NPI, nickel pig iron. Relative to global supply share, Indonesia has only been supplying 25% of the global NPI production, with the remaining balance of 75% coming from China. In terms of the potential, I think we have a big potential. Because why? China does not have the raw material to produce NPI. And that's the reason we are seeing a lot of Chinese investors flocking into the country, trying to grab a slice of that supply portion here, right? So in terms of the potential, I think if regulations are done right in the country, I think Indonesia has the potential to grab much bigger market share in terms of NPI production going forward. Right now, Indonesia holds around 25% market share. Into the next 3 to 4 years, I think if regulations are done right, investment climate is conducive, I think we have a really good chance for Indonesia to grab around 40 to 50% market share of global NPI production.
Okay, so that's very encouraging to hear.